On the night of the 25th of November, 1120, the future King of England boarded a ship on the coast of Normandy. He never reached home. A few hours after leaving the harbour at Barfleur, the white ship struck a rock in the darkness and went down in the cold water of the English Channel. Almost everyone aboard was lost. Among the dead was William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I. England did not collapse the next morning. No army appeared outside London. No castle changed hands before breakfast. Henry was still alive, still powerful, and still very much in control of his kingdom. For another 15 years, outwardly, the machinery of royal government continued to work. But one question had changed. Who would rule when Henry was gone? The king would spend years trying to answer it. He would make the greatest men in England swear that they would accept his daughter, Matilda, as his successor. They would swear, and when the time came, many of them would choose differently. A rival would cross the Channel and reach the crown first. England would divide. A king would be captured in battle. A woman would come close to becoming the first queen to rule England in her own right, only to watch that chance disappear. Castles would change hands, families would change sides, and a generation would grow used to living in a country where the question of who was king could depend on which road you happened to be traveling. Later writers would give the struggle a name that has survived for centuries: the Anarchy. And none of it began with a battlefield. It began with a ship leaving harbour a little too late. Barfleur was an important Norman port, a place accustomed to the traffic between England and the lands ruled by its king across the Channel. In the early 12th century, the English crown was not confined to England. Henry I was also Duke of Normandy, and the royal household moved back and forth between the two sides of the water. That meant crossings were routine, at least by the standards of the age. There were no scheduled ferries, no illuminated harbors, and no weather reports waiting on a desk. A crossing depended on wind, tide, the condition of the ship, the judgment of its master, and a measure of luck. Yet kings, nobles, clerks, merchants, and messengers crossed often enough that the journey itself was not treated as an extraordinary expedition. Henry had already arranged his own passage that November evening when a captain named Thomas Fitzstephen approached him with an offer. Thomas came from a family connected to royal service at sea. His father had reportedly carried William the Conqueror during the Norman invasion of England in 1066. Now the son offered Henry a vessel of his own, a newly fitted ship known as the White Ship. The king declined because his own arrangements had been made, but he allowed members of his household to travel aboard it. That decision placed an extraordinary collection of young aristocrats on one deck. Most important was William Adelin. William was 17 years old and carried something far more valuable than any cargo in the hold. He carried certainty. He was the legitimate son expected to succeed Henry I. For a medieval king, a healthy son could be the difference between a peaceful transfer of power and years of dispute. There was no single written rule of succession that could settle every case automatically. Custom mattered, blood mattered, gender mattered, political support mattered, the wishes of the previous king mattered, and once a throne became uncertain, speed could matter as much as any of them. William simplified all of that. Henry had other children, but William's status was different. He was legitimate, male, acknowledged, and already being prepared for the world he was expected to inherit. His marriage connected the royal family to Anjou. He had performed homage to the French king for Normandy, taking on a role his father could not conveniently perform without creating political difficulties of his own. To the people around Henry's court, William was not merely a possible successor. He was the expected one. And on that late November evening, he was going home. The white ship did not leave with the king's vessel. It remained in Barfleur after dark. Contemporary accounts describe a festive atmosphere among the younger passengers. One chronicler, Orderic Vitalis, says wine was plentiful and that some men had already decided not to sail by the time the ship finally departed. His account was written years later, and details in medieval chronicles deserve care, but it gives us the image that has followed the white ship ever since. A crowded vessel, a young royal company in high spirits, and a crew eager to make up lost time. Once clear of the harbor, the ship headed into darkness. It did not get far. Near the Norman coast lay a dangerous rock known as the Quillebeuf. The white ship struck it. The damage was catastrophic. Wooden ships could survive rough weather, but a hull opened below the waterline gave those aboard very little time. Cold seawater rushed in, the deck tilted. In darkness, among frightened passengers and crew, there was no organized rescue waiting nearby. The ship sank. Medieval sources preserve a story about William that is difficult to prove in every detail, but was important enough to be repeated. According to the account, the prince initially escaped into a small boat. Then he heard cries from those still in the water, including his half-sister, and ordered the boat back. Too many people tried to reach it. The small craft was overwhelmed. William disappeared with the others. By morning, the royal heir was dead. So were many members of the Anglo-Norman elite. The exact number aboard cannot be known with confidence, but the loss was large enough to shock the court on both sides of the channel. Tradition records only one survivor, a man named Berold, a butcher from Rouen, who clung to part of the wreckage through the freezing night until he could be rescued. There is something almost impossible to grasp about the contrast. A ship leaves a harbor carrying princes, noblemen, and heirs to great estates. Hours later, the person left alive to describe the disaster is not one of the most powerful men aboard, but a butcher who happened to survive the water. News traveled more slowly than the disaster itself. Henry had already crossed to England. When word finally reached the royal court, those around him apparently struggled with the task of telling him. Chroniclers describe the king's grief in unusually personal terms. Medieval writers often shaped events to carry moral meaning, so we should be careful about treating every dramatic detail as if a modern reporter had witnessed it. But there is no reason to doubt the central truth. Henry had lost his son. He had also lost his succession plan. The king was in his early 50s. That was not necessarily old, even by medieval standards, but time was no longer on his side. Within months he married again, taking Adeliza of Louvain as his second wife. A new marriage offered the most straightforward solution. Another legitimate son. No such son came. Year followed year, and the problem remained. To understand why this mattered so much, it helps to leave the royal court for a moment and look at the kingdom itself. Early 12th century England was not a country in which the king personally watched every road, village, and castle. Royal authority depended on relationships. Sheriffs collected revenue and represented the crown in the counties. Bishops controlled enormous resources and networks of communication. Great lords held estates scattered across different regions. Castles gave local rulers military weight. Monasteries recorded gifts, disputes, and agreements. Royal clerks carried written orders sealed in the king's name. When the monarch was strong and accepted, these pieces could be pulled toward a common center. When the crown was disputed, the same pieces could pull apart. A noble who controlled 3 castles did not need to declare independence from England to create a serious problem. He only needed to decide that one claimant deserved his loyalty more than another. A sheriff could hesitate. A bishop could change sides. A local feud that had been contained under a powerful king could suddenly become part of a national struggle. That was the danger hidden inside the question of succession. Henry knew it. His daughter, Matilda, would become his answer. She had been born in 1102, long before anyone expected that she might one day inherit England. Her childhood was shaped not by preparation to rule her father's kingdom, but by marriage diplomacy on an enormous scale. As a young girl, she was sent to Germany to marry Henry V, the future Holy Roman Emperor. By modern standards, the age at which royal children were promised in marriage can be startling, but dynastic marriage was a political instrument. A daughter could link 2 ruling houses, turn an enemy into an ally, strengthen a claim, or secure peace along a dangerous frontier. Matilda spent much of her youth far from England. She learned the routines of an imperial court. She appeared beside her husband in public life. She traveled through lands where politics operated on a scale different from the English court she had known as a child. She became accustomed to rank, ceremony, and the expectation that rulers should be obeyed. When Henry V died in 1125, Matilda was still only in her early 20s. She had no surviving children from the marriage, and she returned to her father's political world carrying a title that would remain attached to her for the rest of her life: Empress. Technically, the details of her imperial title could be debated, but to her contemporaries and to later chroniclers, the name mattered. It marked her as a woman who had occupied one of the highest-ranking courts in Europe. Henry now faced a decision that would have seemed unlikely before the White Ship sank. He chose Matilda as his heir. This did not mean everyone immediately accepted the idea with enthusiasm. England had known powerful royal women. Queens could own land, influence appointments, act as regents, and shape diplomacy. But the prospect of a woman inheriting the crown and ruling in her own right was different. There was no established example in England that gave Henry an easy model to point toward, and medieval politics was rarely decided by principle alone. Many nobles were willing to promise loyalty while Henry stood in front of them. What they might do after his death was another question. So Henry tried to bind them publicly. In the late 1120s, leading nobles and churchmen were required to swear oaths recognizing Matilda as the legitimate successor. Among those who swore was Stephen of Blois. At this stage, Stephen was not presented as the obvious villain of a future story. He was Henry's nephew, the son of the king's sister Adela. He was wealthy, well-connected, and deeply embedded in the Anglo-Norman aristocracy. Henry had treated him generously. Stephen held extensive lands and had every reason to remain close to the royal family. He was also a plausible male alternative if Matilda's claim failed. That possibility sat quietly in the background. Henry's next task was to secure his daughter's future and, just as importantly, produce the next generation. Matilda was married again. In 1128, her new husband was Geoffrey of Anjou. If Matilda brought imperial prestige, Geoffrey brought a very different political reality. Anjou lay beside Normandy and had often been a rival rather than a comfortable friend. The marriage was designed to reduce that threat and strengthen Henry's position on the continent. For Matilda, it was not an obviously attractive match. She had been the wife of an emperor. Geoffrey was younger than she was and held the title of count. Their relationship appears to have been difficult, particularly in its early years. But royal marriages were not arranged to provide domestic happiness. They were arranged to solve political problems. In one crucial respect, this one succeeded. In 1133, Matilda gave birth to a son. He was named Henry. A second son followed the next year. Now King Henry, I could imagine a succession stretching beyond his daughter. Matilda would inherit, and after her, her son might rule. On parchment, it was beginning to look orderly again. Real politics was less cooperative. Geoffrey of Anjou was unpopular with some of the Norman aristocracy. The old hostility between Normandy and Anjou did not disappear because a wedding had taken place. Some lords disliked the idea that Matilda's husband might gain influence over them. Others had concerns about Matilda herself, and every year that Henry grew older made the question more urgent. The king responded in the way he knew best, by tightening arrangements, securing oaths, and trying to settle disputes while he was still alive to enforce the result. This is one of the reasons the years before 1135 are so important. The anarchy did not begin because medieval people were incapable of planning a succession. Henry planned obsessively. The problem was that a succession plan was only as strong as the people willing to obey it after the man who created it was gone. In December of 1135, that moment arrived. Henry I was in Normandy. He became ill and died at a royal hunting lodge at Lyon-la-Forêt on the first day of December. Later chroniclers enjoyed repeating a story that the king had eaten too many lampreys despite his physician's advice. It is memorable, which is probably why it has survived so well, but the precise medical cause of his death is beyond recovery. What mattered politically was much simpler. The king was dead, and Matilda was not beside him waiting to take control. She was on the continent, involved in disputes connected to Normandy and Anjou. She was also pregnant. The carefully constructed succession now depended on nobles keeping promises in a moment of uncertainty. Some did. Some hesitated. Stephen moved. The speed of what happened next is difficult to appreciate from a modern world where information moves instantly. In 1135, the death of a king did not appear simultaneously on every screen in the kingdom. A messenger had to ride. A ship had to cross. A bishop had to hear from someone he trusted. A noble might know that Henry was dead, while a town 2 days away still traded under the assumption that he was alive. That delay created opportunity. Stephen was at Boulogne, across the Channel. He crossed to England. Not every door opened immediately. Later accounts suggest that Dover did not simply hand itself over to him. Canterbury was also uncertain. But London mattered more, and London received him. The city had wealth, population, and political importance. Its support gave Stephen something no oath on parchment could provide Matilda at that moment: presence. He was there. She was not. Stephen then moved toward Winchester. Winchester mattered because the royal treasury was there, along with the administrative heart of the kingdom. Control of the crown was not only about sitting on a throne. A claimant needed money to reward supporters, pay troops, maintain households, travel, negotiate, and demonstrate that government continued to function. Stephen had another advantage in Winchester. His younger brother Henry was Bishop of Winchester. A medieval bishop could be a spiritual leader, a landholder, a political operator, and a power broker at the same time. Henry of Blois was all of these. His position gave Stephen access to one of the most influential churchmen in the kingdom at precisely the moment when legitimacy had to be assembled quickly. There was still the problem of the oath. Stephen had sworn to recognize Matilda. So had many of the men whose support he now needed. One explanation emerged, that Henry I had changed his mind before he died and released his nobles from their promises. Hugh Bigod, an important nobleman, was associated with this claim. Whether Henry truly reversed his succession plan is highly doubtful. The story was useful because it gave men who preferred Stephen a way to support him without openly admitting that they had broken a sacred oath. Politics often needs a legal explanation after the decision has already been made. Within weeks, Stephen had gathered enough support to be crowned. On the 22nd of December 1135 at Westminster Abbey, he became King Stephen. Consider how quickly the world had changed. At the beginning of the month, England had an aging but formidable king and a formally recognized female heir. By Christmas, Henry was dead. The heir was still across the channel, and a man who had sworn to support her was wearing the crown. For many people in England, however, the immediate experience would have been far less dramatic than the political story sounds to us now. A farmer in Lincolnshire still had animals to feed. A monk in Canterbury still followed the hours of prayer. A merchant in London still cared whether roads were safe and debts could be collected. Christmas arrived, whether the crown sat on Stephen's head or Matilda's. That ordinary continuity helped Stephen. A successful usurpation becomes easier to accept once it begins to look like government. Stephen issued charters. He held court. He rewarded allies. He sought recognition from the church. In 1136, Pope Innocent II accepted his kingship. For a time, it appeared that the succession crisis had been settled by speed. But beneath the ceremonies, there were weaknesses. Stephen had gained the crown through a coalition of people who expected things from him. Some wanted lands, some wanted offices, some wanted old disputes settled in their favor. A king who comes to power because many powerful men choose him must somehow keep those men choosing him. Stephen's personality did not always help. Even writers who admired his courage could criticize his political judgment. He could be generous where a harsher king might have been feared. He sometimes released enemies who returned to fight him. He struggled to impose a consistent authority over nobles whose support had been essential to his accession. And there was still Matilda. She had not renounced her claim, neither had the people closest to her. One of the first serious challenges came from the north. David I, King of Scots, was Matilda's maternal uncle. Soon after Henry's death, David moved into northern England, claiming to act in support of her rights while also pursuing Scottish interests of his own. Stephen responded quickly enough to avoid an immediate collapse. Agreements were made, broken, and remade. Northern England became one of several regions where the wider succession dispute overlapped with older local ambitions. This would become a pattern. The anarchy was never a single continuous front line stretching neatly across the map. There were places that experienced severe conflict and places that did not. There were lords who changed allegiance more than once. There were private rivalries carried on beneath the larger labels of Stephen and Matilda. Some castles became centers of warfare, while towns, only a short distance away, tried to keep markets open and fields planted. The kingdom was not simply divided into two colored halves. It was becoming a patchwork of loyalties, and in a patchwork kingdom, castles mattered enormously. A stone castle, or even a strongly fortified earth and timber stronghold, could dominate a road, protect a river crossing, shelter soldiers, and provide a lord with a secure base. During the coming conflict, new fortifications appeared, some built with royal permission and others without it. To a traveler, a castle on the horizon could mean protection, taxation, danger, or all three. Imagine not a fantasy landscape filled with enormous towers, but a lived countryside where power was visible in earthworks, palisades, gatehouses, and men carrying weapons at the entrance to a settlement. The presence of a garrison changed the surrounding economy. Soldiers needed food. Horses needed fodder. Messengers came and went. Local labor could be demanded for repairs. Roads became strategically important. A river bridge could suddenly matter because it connected one lord's territory to another. This was the world Stephen now had to control. And for the first years of his reign, he mostly managed to keep the challenge from becoming a full-scale war for the throne. The person who would change that was someone who had initially accepted him, Robert of Gloucester. Robert was Henry I's illegitimate son and therefore Matilda's half-brother. He could not claim the throne on the same terms as a legitimate royal heir, but he was one of the most powerful magnates in the realm. His lands, military resources, and personal reputation made him crucial. At first, Robert did homage to Stephen. That decision tells us something important about the uncertainty of the moment. Even a man as closely connected to Matilda as Robert could decide that acknowledging the crowned king was, for the time being, the safest course. But the relationship did not last. By 1138, Robert had renounced his allegiance to Stephen and declared for Matilda. The conflict was changing. This was no longer only a disputed succession remembered in private conversations. A great lord with castles, money, and soldiers had openly chosen the rival claimant. Rebellion spread through parts of the kingdom. Stephen moved from siege to siege, attempting to reduce hostile strongholds before they could connect into something larger. At times he was effective. At others, his inability to finish enemies permanently allowed problems to return. The year 1138 was violent in the north as well. Scottish forces invaded again, and although they were defeated at the Battle of the Standard near Northallerton, the wider political problem remained unresolved. England now had a crowned king facing rebellion in several directions. What it did not yet have was Matilda herself. That changed in 1139. In late September, a ship reached the south coast of England, carrying the woman whose oath had once been accepted by the nobles of the realm. Matilda landed with Robert of Gloucester. She was no longer a distant claimant across the Channel. She was inside Stephen's kingdom. Her first refuge was Arundel Castle, held by her stepmother, the Dowager Queen Adeliza. Stephen moved toward her. For a moment, the entire war seemed as though it might end before it had properly begun. Matilda was in a castle. Stephen had an army. Her principal military supporter, Robert, had gone west to raise forces. The king had his rival almost within reach, and then he made one of the strangest decisions of his reign. Instead of holding Matilda until her cause collapsed, Stephen allowed her to leave Arundel and travel under safe conduct toward the territory of her supporters in the west. Medieval chroniclers and modern historians have argued over why. Perhaps rules of aristocratic conduct mattered. Perhaps Stephen believed Arundel was not technically in rebellion and did not want to attack a great noblewoman's household. Perhaps he underestimated Matilda's ability to build a serious challenge. Perhaps there were negotiations behind the scenes that are no longer visible to us. Whatever the reason, the result is clear. Stephen had his rival close, and he let her go. Matilda traveled west. There, in the lands around Gloucester and Bristol, she began to build the political and military center of her campaign. The struggle that Henry I had spent 15 years trying to prevent was now unavoidable. England had a king. England had a rival who believed the crown was hers by oath and inheritance. Both had powerful supporters. Both had castles. Both had money to raise and alliances to maintain, and neither could afford to step aside. The next phase would no longer be decided by who reached Westminster first. It would be decided in sieges, negotiations, betrayals, and battle. And before long, King Stephen himself would ride into one of those battles, believing he was defending his crown. He would leave it as a prisoner. When Matilda reached the west of England in the autumn of 1139, she did not arrive at the head of a vast invading army. That is worth remembering, because civil wars often look far more organized in retrospect than they felt to the people living through them. There was no neat line across a map, with Stephen on one side and Matilda on the other. Loyalty could be personal, local, and temporary. A baron might support the king because of family ties, then quarrel with him over a castle. A bishop might prefer one claimant but cooperate with the other because the alternative was disorder in his diocese. Towns cared about trade, tolls, and protection. Landowners cared about who could defend their estates, and everyone understood that choosing the losing side could be expensive. Matilda, therefore, needed more than a claim to the throne. She needed a functioning political base. Bristol became one of the most important places in her cause. It was held by Robert of Gloucester, her half-brother, and it gave her something every medieval claimant required: a secure center from which messages could be sent, money collected, soldiers supplied, and negotiations conducted. Robert was unusually valuable because he was not simply a military commander. He was one of the greatest nobles in the kingdom, experienced, wealthy, and connected across England and Normandy. His support told other lords that Matilda's claim was not merely a family grievance carried across the Channel. It had become a serious alternative government. From the west, her supporters controlled or influenced a network of castles and towns. Gloucester, Bristol, and other strongholds gave them places to retreat, store supplies, and hold prisoners. Oxford would later become another important center. This was how much of the war would be fought, not as one continuous campaign, but as a struggle over strong points. A castle in the 12th century was more than a dramatic stone building on a hill. Many were still built partly from timber and earth. Some had stone keeps. Others relied on walls, ditches, towers, and earthworks. Their value was practical. A castle could protect a road, dominate a river crossing, guard a town, secure a region, and give a small force somewhere difficult to remove them from. That meant a lord with several castles possessed more than impressive residences. He possessed leverage. For ordinary people living nearby, that leverage could be uncomfortable. A garrison needed food. Horses required fodder. Soldiers required pay or some other means of support. When royal government was strong, there were systems for raising revenue and enforcing rules. During a civil war, those systems became uneven. Local power mattered more, and the distinction between legitimate taxation and armed extraction could become very thin. This is one reason later accounts of Stephen's reign remembered disorder so vividly. The phrase "the anarchy" is convenient, but England did not simply dissolve into chaos everywhere at once. Royal administration continued in many places. Churches functioned, markets opened. People married, inherited land, settled disputes, and worked fields. There were regions where life remained comparatively stable, but the crown's ability to impose one unquestioned authority had weakened, and where rival magnates competed, the consequences could be severe. Stephen spent much of 1139 and 1140 trying to contain the rebellion before it became impossible to manage. He was energetic. That had never been his problem. The king could move quickly, appear suddenly before a rebellious castle, raise forces, and conduct sieges with determination. What he struggled to do was turn military activity into a final political settlement. A defeated enemy might be forgiven and return to power. A castle might surrender while another rebellion began somewhere else. A noble who appeared loyal in spring could become dangerous by winter. Then Lincoln changed everything. The city stood in eastern England, dominated by its castle and cathedral above the lower town. Its position made it important, and by late 1140, a dispute there had drawn one of the most powerful men in the kingdom into open confrontation with Stephen. Ranulph, Earl of Chester, had complicated interests in the region. He and his half-brother William of Rumere took control of Lincoln Castle. Stephen eventually moved against them. The details of the maneuvering are tangled, as medieval politics often was. Agreements were attempted. Suspicions remained. By the end of the year, the king had committed himself to a siege of Lincoln Castle. Ranulph escaped the immediate danger and went in search of help. The man he turned to was Robert of Gloucester. For Matilda's cause, this was an opportunity that could not be ignored. A royal army was concentrated at Lincoln. The king himself was there. If Robert and Ranulph could break the siege, they might do more than save a castle. They might capture the center of Stephen's regime in a single afternoon. The date was the 2nd of February, 1141. Candlemas. Winter campaigning was difficult. Roads became unreliable. Rivers rose. Supplies moved slowly. Horses consumed enormous quantities of food, whether they were fighting or not. An army could not simply appear in the countryside without placing pressure on every settlement along its route. Stephen seems to have believed that the season gave him some protection from a major relief force. It did not. Robert and Ranulph approached Lincoln with an army strong enough to force a decision. Before any medieval battle, commanders faced a problem that modern descriptions can easily hide. They had to understand what was happening with imperfect information. There was no aerial view of the field. No radio connected one wing of an army to another. Dust, terrain, buildings, noise, and distance could hide movements. Orders passed through messengers, banners, horns, and personal command. And once formations began to break, control could disappear quickly. Stephen had a choice. He could withdraw and preserve his army, or he could stay and fight. He stayed. The forces that met outside Lincoln were not composed only of armored knights. Medieval armies could include mounted nobles, household troops, infantry, archers, and contingents brought by different lords. Their loyalty and quality varied. A king did not command a modern standing army. He depended heavily on relationships, obligation, money, and reputation. When the battle began, parts of Stephen's mounted force were driven away or left the field. The king did not. Accounts of the battle remember him fighting on foot after his position became desperate. One weapon was said to have broken in his hands before he continued with another. Medieval chroniclers often shaped battle scenes to express character, and their details should not always be read like a modern eyewitness report. But on one point, the sources agree. Stephen remained in the fight until escape was no longer possible. He was surrounded, and the King of England was captured. For 6 years, Matilda had been the claimant who failed to reach the throne first. In a single day, that balance reversed. Stephen was taken away from Lincoln and eventually confined at Bristol Castle. The political effect was immediate, but it did not automatically make Matilda queen. That distinction matters. A medieval English coronation was not simply a decorative ceremony held after power had already changed hands. It carried religious and political weight. Stephen had been anointed and crowned. Whatever people thought of his original claim, he had ruled as king for years. Matilda now had the king in captivity, but she still needed the kingdom to accept her. One of the most important men in that process was Stephen's own brother. Henry of Blois was Bishop of Winchester and papal legate in England. He was a churchman, a great lord, and a political figure with influence far beyond his diocese. He had played an important role in Stephen's accession in 1135. Now Stephen was a prisoner. Henry had to decide what the church should do next. In the spring of 1141, Matilda went to Winchester and negotiated with him. The result brought her closer to the English crown than she had ever been. A church council recognized her in a new position, and she began to use the title Lady of the English, Domina Anglorum. The wording was careful. She had not yet been crowned queen, but she was no longer merely a rebel claimant either. For the people watching events unfold, the change must have been extraordinary. Coins, writs, seals, and royal commands were not abstract constitutional ideas. Government had a physical presence. Orders arrived carrying names and titles. Sheriffs collected revenues. Courts recognized authority. Land grants depended on valid charters. If the identity of the ruler became uncertain, every legal act could carry a question behind it. Whose command would still matter next year? Matilda now began acting as though the answer would be hers. She moved toward London, London was essential. It was not yet the enormous capital it would become centuries later, but it was already the greatest city in England and a centre of wealth, trade, and political influence. A claimant who wanted to rule the kingdom could not comfortably leave London outside her control. The city had supported Stephen. Now, Stephen was imprisoned. Negotiations followed, and Matilda entered London in June 1141. At this point, the story is often reduced to a simple explanation. Matilda behaved arrogantly, demanded too much money, and was expelled by angry Londoners. There is some truth behind the broad outline, but the politics were more complicated than a personality lesson. London had interests of its own. Its citizens had enjoyed concessions under Stephen and expected the ruler to bargain with them. Queen Matilda of Boulogne, Stephen's wife, also named Matilda, remained active and was not prepared to surrender her husband's cause. Royalists still controlled forces nearby. Money was urgently needed. The Empress had supporters to reward and a government to build. And there was another problem. A coronation had not happened yet. The closer Matilda came to the crown, the more every unresolved political disagreement mattered. She could not rule simply by announcing that Henry I had named her heir. She needed London, the church, enough of the nobility and enough practical control of the kingdom to make resistance look pointless. Instead, resistance remained very much alive. Queen Matilda deserves particular attention here because the Civil War is confusing enough to contain two important women with the same name on opposite sides. The Empress Matilda was Henry I's daughter and Stephen's rival. Queen Matilda of Boulogne was Stephen's wife. While her husband sat imprisoned at Bristol, the Queen did not withdraw from politics. She became one of the people who kept his cause from collapsing. She appealed to supporters, worked with commanders, and maintained pressure on London. She had resources and connections of her own, especially through Boulogne, and she possessed something even more valuable: a clear objective. Stephen had to be restored. This is one of the moments when the war stops looking like a simple contest between a king and a would-be queen. Power was distributed through families and networks. Robert of Gloucester carried Matilda's cause militarily. Henry of Blois could shift the political position of the church. Queen Matilda could rally support for Stephen even while Stephen himself was unable to act. No single capture ended the struggle because no single person controlled every part of it. In London, tensions rose. The Empress expected resources from the city. The citizens resisted her demands. At the same time, Queen Matilda's forces were close enough to make the political atmosphere dangerous. Then, London turned against the Empress. On June 24th, before the coronation that might have transformed her position permanently, Matilda was forced to leave. The details come through sources written from particular viewpoints, and later retellings have sometimes made the scene more theatrical than we can securely reconstruct. What matters is the outcome. She had reached the city from which she hoped to be crowned. She left without a crown. It was a remarkable reversal. Only months earlier, Stephen had been captured in battle and carried away as a prisoner. Now his rival, despite holding the advantage, had failed to turn military victory into uncontested rule. And the person who benefited most was Henry of Blois. The bishop's relationship with the Empress deteriorated. By the summer, he was moving back toward his brother's side. Winchester became the next center of the crisis. The city mattered for several reasons. It had deep royal associations. The royal treasury had long been connected with Winchester. Henry of Blois was its bishop. And within and around the city were fortified positions that could be held by opposing forces. Matilda could not simply ignore Henry's change of allegiance. In late July, she moved against Winchester with Robert of Gloucester and her supporters. At first, the operation seemed promising. Henry withdrew into his stronghold at Wolvesey, the bishop's palace and castle complex. Matilda's forces occupied positions in the city and began to pressure him. But this time, the danger was not a king riding to the rescue. It was a queen. Queen Matilda gathered royalist forces, working closely with William of Ypres, one of Stephen's most capable military supporters. Instead of allowing the Empress to isolate Henry, they began to isolate the Empress. For weeks, the struggle around Winchester tightened. This is the kind of medieval warfare that receives less attention than a famous battle, but could be more exhausting to live through. A siege was not constant sword fighting. Much of it was waiting. Guards watched walls and roads. Scouts looked for supply movements. Horses had to be fed. Food had to be found. Wounded men needed care. Messages had to pass through hostile territory. Every day forced commanders to calculate how long their stores would last and whether allies were still coming. Inside a city, civilians faced the same pressure without having chosen to become part of an army. Winchester suffered badly during the fighting. Fire damaged parts of the city. Religious houses and neighborhoods were caught in the conflict. Medieval armies did not possess the ability to separate military spaces cleanly from civilian ones, especially when fortified buildings stood among homes, churches, and streets. By September, Matilda's position had become dangerous. The army supporting her could no longer remain securely where it was. A withdrawal began. Withdrawals are among the most dangerous moments in warfare. An army advancing toward an objective at least knows where it intends to go. An army retreating under pressure must keep enough order to avoid turning movement into panic. Robert of Gloucester took responsibility for helping cover the Empress's escape. Matilda got away. Robert did not. On September 14th, during the fighting remembered as the Rout of Winchester, Robert was captured. And with that, the war produced one of its strangest balances. Stephen was a prisoner of Matilda's side. Robert of Gloucester was a prisoner of Stephen's side. Each faction now held the person the other could least afford to lose. For the Empress, Robert was more than a brother. He was her principal military commander, one of the strongest political foundations of her claim, and a man whose lands and authority held the Western coalition together. For Queen Matilda and the Royalists, Stephen was the king himself. There were attempts to negotiate something larger than an exchange. Could the war end with a settlement? Could one side be persuaded to abandon its claim? The answer, in 1141, was no. Neither faction trusted the future enough to surrender what it believed was its right. So the practical solution was much narrower. They exchanged the prisoners. In November, Stephen was released in return for Robert. The king who had been carried from Lincoln in defeat returned to political life. The church reversed its position again. Stephen's kingship was reaffirmed, and by Christmas he had recovered enough of his authority to appear once more as the crowned ruler of England. The year 1141 had begun with Stephen besieging a castle. Then he lost a battle and became a prisoner. Matilda approached the crown, London rejected her. Her army was driven from Winchester. Robert was captured. And by the end of the year, Stephen was free. If anyone living through those months had tried to predict who would eventually win, certainty would have been difficult. That uncertainty shaped behavior across the kingdom. A noble deciding whether to change sides could not know which seal would validate his lands in 5 years. A town considering resistance could not know which army might arrive next month. A monastery that accepted protection from one lord might find the surrounding district controlled by his enemy before the harvest. The war was not only a contest over a crown, it was a contest over confidence. Who looked permanent? Who could protect supporters? Who could punish enemies? Who would still be issuing charters when today's promises came due? The months after Stephen's restoration also reveal why the war could feel very different depending on where a person lived. There is a temptation to imagine the entire country as a continuous battlefield. It was not. A village could pass through long stretches without seeing a major army. In another district, the presence of a disputed castle or an aggressive lord could make ordinary travel dangerous. The experience of the war was local. If a road remained open, merchants could still move salt, cloth, wine, grain, and livestock. If a bridge or river crossing fell under hostile control, the same journey might suddenly require a toll, an escort, or a long diversion. Markets depended on people believing they could reach them and return home safely. A breakdown in that confidence could hurt a town even when no battle took place inside its walls. Coinage also mattered. Medieval kingship was visible in money, and the weakening of central authority during Stephen's reign was reflected in increasingly complicated local minting. Coins were still used, taxes were still collected, and trade continued. But political fragmentation could make the monetary world less predictable. For a person buying food in a market, arguments over royal legitimacy eventually reached all the way down to the small silver pieces changing hands on a wooden stall. The church occupied an equally complicated position. Monasteries and cathedral communities were landowners as well as religious institutions. They held estates, managed tenants, received gifts, and negotiated with powerful neighbors. A monastery might pray for peace while also having to decide how to protect its grain, animals, documents, and property from armed men. Bishops could be spiritual leaders and major political actors at the same time. Henry of Blois was the clearest example, but he was not the only churchman forced to navigate a divided kingdom. And then there were the castles. Contemporary writers complained bitterly about fortifications raised or controlled by local lords during the conflict. Later generations sometimes pictured an England covered overnight by illegal castles, each one occupied by a private tyrant. The reality was more varied, but the fear behind the complaints was real. A fortified site gave its holder the ability to dominate the surrounding countryside. For a farmer, the political argument between Stephen and Matilda might be distant. The men arriving to demand grain were not. For a merchant, the legal question of succession might be complicated. The armed checkpoint ahead was not. For a family living near a contested stronghold, the war could arrive not as a famous battle, but as missing animals, an extra levy, a damaged field, a road avoided after sunset, or news that soldiers were quartered nearby. None of this happened evenly, and that is important. The period was not 19 years of identical misery, but the uncertainty made abuses harder to contain because authority itself was disputed. A complaint was only useful if there was a court strong enough to enforce the answer. This was the quieter damage of the Civil War. Not every consequence left a dramatic story for a chronicler. Sometimes the evidence is simply a kingdom in which the rules had become less certain than they had been under Henry I. In 1142, Stephen tried to make the answer clearer. He went back on the offensive. Matilda, meanwhile, increasingly used Oxford as an important base. Oxford was well positioned for her. It sat within reach of Western territory, friendly to her cause, while also projecting influence toward the center and southeast. The castle was strong, and the rivers around the town contributed to its defenses. But a strong castle could become a trap if the enemy controlled everything outside it. In the autumn of 1142, Stephen moved rapidly against Oxford. The attack demonstrated one of his greatest strengths: personal energy. He approached across difficult ground and water, and his forces entered the town. Matilda withdrew into Oxford Castle. Stephen had failed to contain her at Arundel 3 years earlier. This time, he would not simply let her travel away under escort. He settled into a siege. The castle could not be taken easily by direct assault, so time became a weapon. A garrison behind walls could be extremely difficult to defeat if it had food, water, and hope of relief. If any of those disappeared, stone offered less protection than it seemed. Every person inside consumed supplies. Every horse consumed more. Grain, salted meat, ale, firewood, candles, and fodder were not background details. They determined how long resistance could continue. Outside, Stephen's own army had to survive the winter as well. This is why long sieges were contests of logistics as much as courage. The king could watch the gates and crossings. He could prevent relief forces from reaching the castle. He could wait for hunger and cold to achieve what an assault might cost hundreds of lives to accomplish. Weeks passed. Autumn gave way to winter. Matilda was still inside. Robert of Gloucester was not in a position to break the siege immediately. He had gone to Normandy during part of the year, seeking support and coordinating with Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, whose own campaign across Normandy was changing the wider balance of the family's fortunes. Inside Oxford, the problem became simple. If Matilda stayed until the castle surrendered, she could be captured. And everyone had already seen what the capture of a major leader could do to the war. Her escape became necessary. It also became the most famous episode of her life. The traditional story places it in a landscape covered with snow. On a December night, Matilda left Oxford Castle with only a few companions. Later accounts describe her wearing white so that she would be difficult to see against the snow. Some versions say she was lowered from the walls. Others emphasize the frozen water and the dangerous crossing through Stephen's lines. The exact details are not equally secure, and the story became more polished as it was retold. But the central fact is not in doubt. Matilda escaped a castle that Stephen believed he had effectively sealed. Think about what that required without turning it into legend. The night had to be chosen carefully. Routes had to be known. The movements of guards mattered. Companions had to be trusted, because one frightened man or one poorly timed sound could expose everyone. The distance to safety had to be crossed in winter conditions. probably with little of the equipment a noble household would normally carry. A high-born woman who usually moved with servants, horses, and an entourage was now leaving one of the strongest positions available to her because remaining inside it was more dangerous than crossing enemy lines in the dark. She made it out. The castle surrendered soon afterward. Stephen had taken Oxford, but once again he had failed to take Matilda. She reached safety and eventually re-established her court at Devizes. The war continued. Yet something important had changed. By the end of 1142, the conflict had already produced its most dramatic reversals. Stephen had been captured and restored. Matilda had nearly reached coronation and been driven from London. Robert had been captured and exchanged. Oxford had fallen while Matilda escaped. Neither side had proved capable of destroying the other. And that meant England was entering a different kind of war. The next years would contain fewer moments when the entire crown seemed likely to change hands in a single day. Instead, the struggle would settle into something slower. Castles would matter more. Local alliances would matter more. Money would matter more. And while Stephen and Matilda continued to contest the kingdom, another figure was growing old enough to become important. Matilda's eldest son, Henry. He had inherited his mother's claim. He also carried the ambitions of his father, Geoffrey of Anjou, whose conquest of Normandy was steadily removing one of Stephen's most important foundations across the Channel. The war that began because Henry I had no surviving legitimate son was beginning to produce its final answer in the next generation. But England was not there yet. Before Henry could become the solution, the kingdom would live through years in which neither claimant could force a conclusion. For the people who inhabited those years, the great question was no longer simply who should have inherited the crown in 1135. It was how long the uncertainty could continue, and what it would cost before it finally ended. By the beginning of 1143, the war had changed its character. There was still a king in England. Stephen still wore the crown, issued charters, travelled with his household, appointed officials, and expected obedience where he could enforce it. There was still a rival court as well. Matilda remained in the west, surrounded by men who continued to call her the rightful heir of Henry I. But the dramatic year of 1141 was over. The kingdom had watched Stephen fall into captivity. Matilda approached the throne. London reject her. Robert of Gloucester become a prisoner. Stephen returned to power. And Oxford Castle change hands after one of the most famous escapes of the age. After all of that movement, the crown was almost exactly where it had been before. Stephen had it. Matilda still claimed it. Neither could make the other disappear. For the people living through the next stage of the conflict, that stalemate mattered more than any single battle. A civil war does not have to produce a major battle every month to shape daily life. Sometimes, the most exhausting part comes when no one knows whether the war is ending, spreading, or simply settling into the landscape. That was increasingly the situation in England. The country was not one continuous battlefield. It is important not to imagine every village burning or every road filled with soldiers for 19 uninterrupted years. Modern historians have pushed back against that older picture because the evidence shows something more uneven. Some regions suffered badly. Others experienced long periods in which ordinary work continued. Markets opened. Fields were planted. Monasteries kept accounts. Ships crossed the channel. Children were born into families that had already been living with the succession dispute for years. The problem was that royal authority had become inconsistent. In one county, a powerful lord might enforce order effectively. In another, two rival castles could dominate the same roads and estates. A traveller might leave an area controlled by Stephen, cross land held by a supporter of Matilda, pass a manor whose lord had made a private agreement with both sides, and arrive at a town mainly interested in keeping everyone outside its walls. Loyalty in such a world could become practical rather than permanent. A nobleman had family lands to protect, tenants to manage, debts to collect, heirs to provide for, and castles to defend. Supporting one claimant to the crown might be a matter of principle, but it was also a decision with financial and military consequences. If the other side became stronger nearby, principle could become expensive. This is one reason the later years of the Anarchy are less tidy than the opening years. There is no simple line on a map with Stephen on one side and Matilda on the other. Instead, there were pockets of influence, personal rivalries, local truces and castles, whose importance could be greater than the size of the settlements around them suggested. A castle was not only a residence, it was a warehouse, a place of refuge, a military base, a symbol of authority and, when necessary, a way to control movement through the surrounding countryside. From its walls, mounted men could be sent to watch a road, collect supplies, or threaten an opponent's estate. Inside were stores of grain, barrels of drink, weapons, horses, servants, and the people required to keep the place functioning. A castle could make a local lord difficult to ignore. During Stephen's reign, chroniclers complained about the number of fortifications raised without effective royal permission. These are often called adulterine castles, though the reality behind that label is complicated. Some were substantial strongholds. Others may have been smaller earth and timber works, improved manor houses, or hastily strengthened sites. What mattered was not whether every new fortification looked like the great stone castles that survive today. What mattered was control. If a lord could secure a mound, surround it with a ditch and timber palisade, place armed men there, and make the surrounding district answer to him, then the political weakness at the center of the kingdom had become something visible on the ground. For a farmer, that could mean a new demand for food or labor. For a merchant, it might mean another toll on the road. For a monastery, it could mean negotiating carefully with whichever armed neighbor happened to be strongest that season. The Peterborough Chronicle, written by monks who had experienced Stephen's reign, gives one of the bleakest descriptions of these years. Its author remembered private castles, heavy exactions, and people suffering while justice failed them. The language is emotional, and historians do not treat every line as a neutral statistical report. But the complaint itself tells us something important. People expected a king to do more than sit on a throne. He was supposed to keep the peace. He was supposed to provide courts where disputes could be settled without private force. He was supposed to punish men who took more power than custom allowed. When royal government could not do those things consistently, the weakness was felt far from Westminster or Winchester. Stephen was not absent from this struggle. He spent much of his reign moving. Medieval kings did not govern from one permanent capital in the modern sense. The royal household traveled, consuming enormous quantities of food and receiving petitions, messengers, and local officials wherever the king happened to be. For Stephen, constant movement was also military necessity. A rebellion in one part of the country might require his presence. A threatened castle somewhere else could pull him away. A baron whose loyalty seemed uncertain might have to be watched, rewarded, or confronted. This made Stephen energetic, but energy was not the same as control. He could arrive quickly and fight hard. Yet the moment he moved elsewhere, the political calculation of the district he had left behind could begin again. Matilda faced the opposite problem. She had a secure political center in the west, but she lacked the resources to transform that base into control of the whole kingdom. Bristol was especially important to her cause. The city and its castle were tied closely to Robert of Gloucester, and Bristol became one of the safest places for Matilda's supporters. From there, communication with the Severn Valley, Wales, and the western counties was easier than it would have been from a more isolated fortress. But even a strong regional base could not crown her in London. The war had demonstrated that already. So both sides continued, each waiting for circumstances to change. And across the Channel, circumstances were changing. While Stephen fought to keep England, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had been attacking his position in Normandy. This part of the conflict is easy to overlook because the crown of England draws most of the attention. But Henry I had ruled both England and Normandy, and the two were deeply connected by landholding families, trade, politics, and personal movement. A great noble might own estates on both sides of the Channel. Losing Normandy was therefore not simply losing a foreign province. It damaged the political world on which Stephen's kingship had been built. Geoffrey's advance was gradual. He did not conquer the duchy in one spectacular campaign. Strongholds had to be taken, agreements made, and local elites persuaded that Stephen could no longer protect his position there. By 1144, Geoffrey had effectively secured Normandy and was recognized as its duke. That created an extraordinary contrast. Stephen remained King of England, but the continental lands once ruled by Henry I were now in the hands of Matilda's husband. The family that had failed to take the English crown was becoming stronger around it, and behind Matilda and Geoffrey stood their eldest son, Henry. He was still a boy when the Civil War began. By the middle of the 1140s, he was becoming old enough to matter. The shift was gradual enough that Stephen may not initially have regarded him as the central threat he would later become. Matilda's claim had a history attached to it. It was bound to the oaths made to Henry I, to the disputed succession of 1135, and to years of conflict that had already disappointed many of her supporters. Henry offered something slightly different. He carried the same hereditary claim, but he did not carry the same defeats. He was a new possibility. In 1147, at around 14 years old, Henry made his first military expedition to England. It was not the triumphant arrival of a future king. In fact, it went badly. He crossed from Normandy with a small force, including hired soldiers, and entered the Western Theatre where his mother's supporters had been active for years. The young Henry seems to have launched the expedition without enough money to sustain it. Mercenaries expected to be paid. Ships cost money. Horses ate constantly. Men on campaign consumed supplies whether or not they won anything. A medieval military venture could collapse for reasons that had nothing to do with courage. Henry soon discovered that he could not meet his expenses. The situation became embarrassing enough that he needed help simply to leave England. And the person who ultimately helped him was the man whose crown he had come to challenge. Stephen. The king paid money that allowed Henry's unpaid force to be settled and the young claimant to return across the channel. The exact reason Stephen chose to do this is uncertain. Perhaps it was an act of aristocratic generosity toward a young relative who had overreached. Perhaps Stephen considered 14-year-old Henry less dangerous than Matilda and saw no advantage in humiliating him. Perhaps there was already, beneath the warfare, an awareness that this conflict might eventually require some kind of family settlement. Whatever Stephen's motive, the result is one of the strangest small episodes of the Anarchy. The future Henry II came to England to challenge Stephen and ended the expedition with Stephen helping him go home. At the time, it must have looked like failure, but 1147 was important for another reason. Robert of Gloucester died that year. His death removed one of the central figures from Matilda's cause. Robert had been more than a commander. He was Henry I's illegitimate son, Matilda's half-brother, one of the richest nobles in the kingdom, and the man who had done more than almost anyone else to give her claim a military foundation in England. He had escorted her into the country in 1139. He had fought at Lincoln. He had become a prisoner at Winchester and had been exchanged for Stephen himself. For years, his resources and reputation held together a coalition that was not always easy to manage. When he died, there was no obvious replacement with the same combination of rank, wealth, loyalty, and military authority. Matilda was still politically formidable, but the campaign in England was losing the man who had made much of it possible. The wider world was changing as well. The Second Crusade drew nobles and knights away from Western Europe. Men who might otherwise have spent money and energy in local warfare prepared for a far more distant campaign. At the same time, some English barons began making arrangements with one another that had little to do with final victory for Stephen or Matilda. If the crown could not quickly impose peace, local men could create pieces of peace for themselves. They could agree not to attack one another's lands. They could recognize possession of disputed property for the moment. They could marry families together, exchange guarantees, and concentrate on preserving what years of war had left them. This is one reason the conflict began to quiet without actually being solved. The political question remained enormous. Who would inherit England? But the immediate military question became less urgent in many places. How much more did anyone really gain by burning another estate, besieging another small castle, or paying another group of armed men for a campaign that might change nothing? In 1148, Matilda left England and returned to Normandy. There was no dramatic surrender. She did not publicly renounce the claim she had spent years pursuing, but the move recognized the direction in which events were going. Her own chance of being crowned had passed. The future of the claim now rested increasingly with Henry. It is worth stopping here, because this is the point at which the story changes generations. The war had begun because Henry I's son died, and Henry I tried to make his daughter heir. Now that daughter was withdrawing from the English battlefield, and her own son was beginning to take her place. Henry's childhood had been shaped by a succession dispute that began before he was born. He had grown up hearing that a kingdom across the sea should one day belong to his family. Yet England was only one part of what he stood to inherit. In 1150, Henry received Normandy from his parents. In 1151, after Geoffrey of Anjou died, Henry became Count of Anjou as well. He was not yet King of England, but he already controlled lands that made him one of the most important young princes in Western Europe. Then, in 1152, his position changed again in a way that no one in 1135 could have predicted. Henry married Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor was not simply a prestigious bride. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, and one of the greatest heiresses in Europe. She had already been Queen of France as the wife of Louis VII. That marriage had been annulled in March 1152. Only a short time later, Eleanor married Henry. He was about 19. She was around 11 years older and brought with her claims to a vast territory stretching across much of southwestern France. The marriage did not instantly give Henry perfect control of every mile of Aquitaine. Medieval lordship was never that simple. But on a political map, the effect was astonishing. Henry now stood at the center of a collection of territories reaching from Normandy and Anjou toward the Pyrenees. Stephen, meanwhile, remained king of an England that had spent years divided over whether he should have been king at all. The balance had shifted. The boy whose first expedition had ended because he could not pay his soldiers was becoming richer, older, and far harder to dismiss. Before that transformation was complete, Henry returned to England once more. In 1149, 2 years after his unsuccessful first venture, he traveled north. At Carlisle, he met David I, King of Scots, who was his great-uncle and an old supporter of Matilda's claim. David had occupied Carlisle after Henry I's death and had become one of the most important powers in northern Britain. The castle there stood in a landscape where English and Scottish politics overlapped constantly. At Carlisle, Henry was knighted by David. The ceremony mattered. Knighthood was not merely the moment someone was allowed to carry a sword. For a young aristocrat, it marked entry into an adult political and military world. A knight was expected to maintain honor, serve a lord, command men, and defend his rights by force when required. For Henry, the symbolism was especially strong. He was no longer simply Matilda's son traveling with older men who directed the war around him. He was beginning to appear as a claimant in his own right. There were plans for a northern campaign involving Henry, David, and Ranulph, Earl of Chester. York was a possible target, but Stephen learned enough about the threat to move north with a strong force of his own. The planned coalition did not come together as intended, and Henry eventually returned to Normandy. Again, there was no decisive victory. Again, England remained Stephen's. But something subtle had changed. Stephen could defeat a plan. He could not stop Henry from growing up. And the king had his own succession problem. Stephen's eldest surviving son, Eustace, was the obvious person he wanted to follow him. For Stephen, this was more than a father's ambition. If Eustace could be accepted and ideally crowned during Stephen's lifetime, the uncertainty that had haunted the reign might finally be closed in his family's favor. A crowned Eustace would make Henry's claim much harder to present as the peaceful solution to England's troubles. On the continent, The practice of crowning a son during his father's lifetime was not unknown. In England, however, Stephen could not simply place a crown on Eustace's head by personal decision. The church mattered. A coronation required bishops, ritual, and legitimacy. And by the early 1150s, the English church was not willing to give Stephen what he wanted. Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, resisted the plan without papal approval. Rome did not support the coronation of Eustace. In 1152, Stephen pressed the issue at a council in London. Some nobles were prepared to acknowledge Eustace as heir. The bishops would not crown him. The disagreement became severe enough that Stephen attempted to pressure churchmen into compliance, and Theobald eventually left the country for a time. This was a dangerous failure for the king. Nearly 17 years after taking the throne with the help of church support, Stephen could not secure the church's blessing for the succession of his own son. That did not mean Eustace had no supporters. It did mean the future remained open. And once again, the original problem of 1120 returned in another form. A king could hold power today. The harder question was what happened tomorrow. By now, people who had been adults when the white ship sank were growing old. A child born in the year Stephen was crowned would be approaching 18. For an entire generation, uncertainty over the crown was not a crisis remembered from the past. It was the normal political background of life. That makes the later anarchy difficult to describe dramatically, because the most important development was often exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of every person in England in exactly the same way. The exhaustion of a political class that had begun to understand the limits of victory. Stephen's supporters could defend his kingship. They could not make Henry's hereditary claim disappear. Henry's supporters could wait for his power to grow. They could not remove Stephen without risking another major round of war. Barons on both sides had accumulated lands, castles, and local arrangements they did not want to gamble away in one final battle. The bishops wanted a settlement that could restore more predictable government. Towns wanted roads and markets that worked. Landholders wanted inheritance disputes settled by courts rather than armed neighbors. Even men who had benefited from Stephen's weakness had reason to fear what endless uncertainty might eventually cost them. For ordinary households, royal succession could seem distant until it arrived at the door in practical form. A demand for horses, a cart requisitioned for supplies, a field damaged by men moving between castles, a toll collected by someone who claimed the right to collect it, a court delayed because the local balance of power had changed again. A landlord absent on campaign. A monastery asked for money by one faction and then expected to explain the payment to another. Yet daily life continued around all of it. At sunrise, ovens still had to be heated. Animals still had to be fed. Mills still turned when there was water to move them. Ale still had to be brewed because drinking and hospitality depended on it. Winter stores had to last until spring. Wool had to be spun, timber cut, roofs patched, and tools repaired. The rhythm of medieval life did not pause for a constitutional crisis. This contrast is one of the most important things to understand about the period. At the highest level, England had spent years arguing over the legitimacy of its ruler. At ground level, most people still had to wake up and complete the work that kept a household alive. That is why the phrase, "the anarchy," can mislead if we hear it too literally. There was disorder, there was violence. There were regions where private power became frighteningly strong, but there was also government, trade, religious life, agriculture, and local administration continuing through the conflict. Stephen's reign was weakened, not erased. And by the early 1150s, what England lacked most was not civilization. It lacked a durable answer to succession. Henry was becoming that answer almost by accumulation. Normandy came to him, then Anjou. Then marriage brought Aquitaine into his political world. He had the blood claim through Matilda. He had powerful supporters in England. He had allies in Scotland. And unlike in 1147, he now had the resources to mount a serious campaign. Stephen understood the danger. Eustace understood it too. The question was whether Henry would wait for Stephen to die or cross the Channel and force the issue while the king was still alive. Near the end of 1152, preparations began. Ships had to be found. Men had to be gathered. Money had to be arranged. Messages crossed between Henry's supporters in England and his territories on the continent. This time, the young duke was not coming as a 14-year-old with a force he could barely afford. He was coming as Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and husband of the Duchess of Aquitaine. He was 20 years old. Across England, old supporters of Matilda had reason to become active again. Others, who had never loved her cause, could look at Henry and see something different from the woman who had nearly taken London 12 years earlier. He was male, which removed one of the objections that had always complicated Matilda's claim. He was young, which suggested the possibility of a long reign after years of uncertainty. And he was powerful enough that supporting him no longer looked like a gamble on a distant child. Still, nothing was guaranteed. Stephen had survived every reversal the war had produced. He had been captured and returned to the throne. He had watched Matilda escape Oxford and still kept the crown. He had outlasted Robert of Gloucester. He had ruled through rebellions, invasions, and political defections for 17 years. A weaker man might have disappeared long before. Stephen had not. So when Henry's ships approached England in January 1153, the country was not waiting for an obvious winner. It was waiting to see whether the old war was about to begin again. Henry landed on the southern coast with a relatively modest army. There would be no enormous invasion fleet filling the horizon. No single battle had been arranged to decide the crown. Instead, the final campaign of the Anarchy would begin in the same complicated way much of the war had been fought, with castles, with negotiations, with men deciding whether to fight, and with two armies discovering that after 18 years, the people expected to do the fighting were becoming less interested in dying for a question that might be settled another way. The first test would come at Malmesbury. The decisive moment would come later, beside the Thames at Wallingford, and before the year was over, one unexpected death would remove the greatest obstacle to peace. The war that began with the death of a son was moving toward its end through the fate of another. Henry's first weeks in England did not look like the beginning of a final victory. They looked like another campaign in a war that had already lasted too long. He had landed in January 1153 with enough men to be taken seriously, but not enough to simply march to London and remove Stephen from the throne. That distinction mattered. Henry was no longer the boy who had crossed to England 6 years earlier and then struggled to pay his soldiers. He now possessed Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and, through Eleanor, Aquitaine. His position on the continent gave him resources, reputation, and leverage that his mother's cause had never possessed in quite the same way. But England still had a crowned king. Stephen still controlled important towns and castles. He still had loyal followers. And after 18 years of shifting alliances, few experienced nobles were eager to stake everything on one reckless encounter. Henry's campaign therefore began with pressure rather than spectacle. One of the first important places in his path was Malmesbury, a fortified town in Wiltshire whose castles stood in a region long connected with the Angevin cause. The winter was wet, roads were difficult. Moving men, horses, food, and equipment through the countryside could be as important as anything that happened on a battlefield. A medieval army did not travel as a self-contained machine. It consumed the country around it. Animals needed fodder. Men needed bread, ale, meat, and dry places to sleep. Carts broke axles. Horses lost shoes. Rivers rose after rain and turned familiar crossings into obstacles. Every extra day in the field cost money. Every delay increased the chance that hired soldiers would become restless, or that local lords would reconsider their promises. Stephen moved to oppose Henry. For a moment, another major confrontation seemed possible. Yet once again, weather, fortifications, and caution prevented the clean decision that chroniclers and later storytellers might have preferred. The war had produced enough dramatic reversals already. Lincoln had shown that a king could be captured and still return to his throne. Winchester had shown that a near victor could be driven away within months. Oxford had shown that even a tightly closed siege could end with the most important person slipping through the line. Nobody could now assume that one more battle would settle anything. Henry understood something else as well. He did not need to conquer every castle in England. He needed to make enough people believe that his eventual succession was more useful than continued resistance. That was a different kind of campaign. It meant talking to men who had once fought against his mother. It meant accepting temporary arrangements that would have looked unsatisfactory to someone still thinking in terms of complete victory. It meant recognizing that many barons were no longer asking which claimant had the purest right. They were asking which settlement would protect their estates, their heirs, and their ability to live without another decade of private war. This mood had been developing for years. The longer the conflict continued, the more local agreements appeared between men who were technically on opposite sides. A lord might support Stephen in national politics while quietly agreeing not to raid the lands of a neighboring lord who supported Henry. Two rivals could arrange truces around harvest time. Castles could remain hostile in theory, while roads between them became safer in practice. Such compromises were not signs that people had forgotten the succession dispute. They were signs that daily life could not wait for the dispute to end. Fields still had to be planted, rents still had to be collected, mills still had to grind grain, markets still depended on merchants being willing to travel. A village that lost its seed grain to soldiers did not recover because a chronicler later decided which claimant had been lawful. By 1153, this practical exhaustion had become one of Henry's greatest advantages. He could offer something Matilda had struggled to offer in 1141, not an immediate replacement of the king, but a credible future. Stephen, meanwhile, had a future of his own in mind. His eldest surviving son, Eustace, was the obvious person he wanted to follow him. Stephen had tried to secure recognition for Eustace during his lifetime, but the political and ecclesiastical support required for that plan was not there. The papacy would not simply approve a second coronation to make Eustace king beside his father, and by 1153, many magnates who might once have accepted the arrangement could see the danger clearly. If Eustace were established as heir while Henry remained powerful across the Channel, the civil war would not end with Stephen's death. It would begin again under younger men. The question hanging over England was therefore becoming simpler. Not who could win the old war, but whether anyone was willing to hand it to the next generation. Through the spring and early summer, Henry moved through parts of western and central England, gathering support and forcing Stephen to respond. There were sieges, marches, and local clashes, but the campaign's real achievement was political. Men who had spent years keeping their options open began to treat Henry not as Matilda's distant son, but as a plausible next king. That difference was enormous. Henry could speak for his mother's hereditary claim while also avoiding one of the objections that had damaged her chances. He was a man in a society accustomed to male kingship. He was already a ruler in his own territories. He had lands powerful English nobles could not afford to ignore, and at 20 years old, he represented the possibility of stability, stretching decades into the future. By July, the two sides converged on Wallingford. The town stood beside the Thames, and its castle had been one of the strongest Angevin positions in England. It had resisted Stephen's pressure for years. Now Stephen's forces and Henry's supporters found themselves facing one another in a place that seemed perfectly suited to produce the decisive battle everyone claimed to want. The armies were close. The river divided them. Men on both sides could see the banners of opponents they had known, fought, or negotiated with for years. This should have been the moment when 18 years of conflict were compressed into a few hours. Instead, something more revealing happened. Many of the barons did not want to fight. That reluctance has sometimes been described as simple cowardice or selfishness. It was neither simple nor surprising. Some of these men had changed sides more than once. Some had family connections across the political divide. Some held estates in regions controlled by different factions. Many knew that a battle could kill the very people needed to make any later settlement work. And almost everyone present had already seen how little certainty victory on a single day could provide. At Lincoln, Stephen had lost the battle and his freedom. He had still recovered the crown before the year was over. So at Wallingford, the men expected to charge were increasingly unwilling to do it. Negotiations began. The exact sequence is difficult to reconstruct in every detail, because medieval accounts do not offer us a clean transcript of who said what beside the river. But the direction is clear. Churchmen and nobles pushed the rivals toward a truce. Stephen and Henry met. For the first time, the end of the war could be imagined without the destruction of either claimant. The simplest arrangement was also the one that had become politically possible only after years of failure. Stephen would remain king. Henry would not attempt to depose him immediately. In return, Henry would be recognized as the man who would succeed him. It was not yet the final treaty. There were still arguments to settle. There were still men who hated the idea. Most important among them was Eustace. From his point of view, compromise was not peace. It was dispossession. He was the king's son. He had spent his adult life expecting to inherit his father's position. Now men who had sworn loyalty to Stephen were discussing an agreement that would place the son of Stephen's rival ahead of him. For Eustace, the proposal cut through every ordinary political calculation. Henry could afford to wait for Stephen to die. Eustace could not. His future disappeared the moment Henry became accepted as heir. Accounts of the weeks after Wallingford describe continuing unrest and hostility around the negotiations. Peace had been discussed, but it had not yet become a settled fact. Then, in August 1153, the structure of the succession changed again with almost no warning. Eustace died. He was still a young man. The precise medical cause cannot be recovered with certainty from the surviving sources, and later retellings added moral judgments that tell us as much about medieval writers as they do about the death itself. What mattered politically was immediate. Stephen had lost the son around whom resistance to Henry's succession could most naturally have continued. There was another son, William, but William did not occupy the same political position, and he would ultimately accept a settlement that preserved substantial lands and status without demanding the crown. The strange symmetry of the anarchy had become impossible to miss. The crisis had begun after Henry I lost his son William in the White Ship. Now the path to ending that crisis opened after Stephen lost his son Eustace. Neither death was planned as a political event. Neither was a battlefield victory. Yet both altered the succession more completely than many battles had done. Stephen had spent years trying to preserve a dynasty. He was also, by this point, a man who had endured the death of his wife, Matilda of Blois, the loss of close supporters, capture, rebellion, and nearly 2 decades of unstable rule. Whatever personal feelings lay behind his decisions, the political calculation had become difficult to avoid. Henry was powerful enough to continue. The barons were tired enough to negotiate, and the clearest alternative heir on Stephen's side was dead. By autumn, the tentative understanding reached around Wallingford could be turned into something formal. In November 1153, Stephen and Henry reached the settlement generally known as the Treaty of Winchester, though the long process of agreement is also associated with Wallingford and was later confirmed more publicly. The central bargain was remarkably practical. Stephen would keep the crown for the rest of his life. Henry would recognize him as king and would not attempt to remove him by force. Stephen, in turn, would recognize Henry as his heir. Henry was treated publicly as Stephen's successor, sometimes described in the language of an adopted son. Stephen's younger son, William, would retain important possessions rather than continue a hopeless contest for the throne. The agreement also addressed the wider problem that had made the Civil War so damaging. The crown needed to recover authority over castles, royal lands, and local power. Mercenaries and private garrisons could not simply remain in place forever. The settlement, therefore, pointed toward the restoration of royal control, after years in which individual lords had often strengthened themselves at the monarchy's expense. No document could repair England overnight. A treaty did not rebuild a burned house. It did not return livestock taken years before. It did not restore men who had died in sieges or raids. It did not erase local grudges, but it changed the incentives that had kept those problems alive. A baron no longer had to choose between 2 competing futures. A bishop no longer had to wonder whether recognizing one claimant meant facing the other claimant as king a year later. A castle commander could negotiate surrender without assuming that war would simply resume next spring. Most importantly, everyone now knew what was supposed to happen when Stephen died. That was the certainty Henry I had possessed before the white ship sank. For the first time in more than 30 years, England could again see an agreed line from the living king to the next one. The difference could be felt even before the crown changed hands. Henry did not remain in England waiting impatiently for Stephen's death. He returned to his continental territories. That decision itself helped demonstrate that the settlement was real. If he had believed Stephen would betray him immediately, leaving the kingdom would have been reckless. If Stephen had intended to exclude him as soon as the young duke crossed the channel, the peace would have collapsed at once. Instead, the rivals entered an unusual final phase. Stephen still ruled, Henry waited, and England, after years in which almost every change of fortune had invited another campaign, began to live under an agreed succession. Stephen's last year did not transform him into a ceremonial figure. He remained king until the end. Royal government continued in his name. Charters were issued. Disputes still had to be judged. Sheriffs and officials still had work to do. The roads were not instantly safe, and every unauthorized castle did not vanish at once. But the central question that had poisoned politics since 1135 was no longer open in the same way. Stephen would die as king. Henry would become king after him. There would be no coronation for Matilda. There would be no coronation for Eustace. The compromise gave neither side the perfect victory it once wanted. That was one reason it worked. Matilda, from Normandy, had every reason to accept it. For nearly 2 decades, her claim had defined the conflict. She had crossed to England, survived sieges, briefly dominated the kingdom's politics, and come close to receiving the crown. Yet the final settlement did not place the crown on her head. It placed the future in the hands of her son. For Matilda, that was not a trivial consolation. Dynastic politics rarely ended with one lifetime. Her father's intention had been that his descendants continue to rule. Through Henry, they would. The woman who had once been rejected as an unacceptable ruler would live to see her son accepted as the uncontested successor to the man who had taken her throne. Stephen, too, received something the language of defeat can obscure. He was not dragged from the throne. He was not imprisoned again. He was not forced into exile. He retained the kingship for life and secured honorable treatment for his surviving son. After everything that had happened since 1135, this mattered. The peace was not a declaration that one side had always been right. It was an agreement that the country could no longer afford to make absolute victory a condition for ending the war. In October 1154, less than a year after the settlement, Stephen was at Dover. The great port and castle looked across the channel toward the continental world that had shaped so much of his reign. Normandy had once been part of his struggle. Now it belonged to the young man waiting to inherit England. Stephen became ill and died on the 25th of October. He had been king for almost 19 years. For most of those years, someone had disputed his right to be there. His reign had begun with astonishing speed. Henry I died in Normandy. Stephen crossed to England. London accepted him. He secured the treasury and was crowned before Matilda could turn her hereditary claim into political control. His reign ended in almost the opposite manner. There was no race, no rival rushed for Westminster, no group of magnates suddenly produced another claimant. The succession had already been agreed. Henry was across the channel when Stephen died. For once, delay was not dangerous. The crown could wait for him. Henry remained on the continent for several weeks while arrangements were made and weather affected travel. Then, in December, he crossed England. He was 21 years old. Eleanor came with him. She was not simply the wife of a new king. She was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right and had already been Queen of France before her marriage to Henry. Together, the couple represented a concentration of territory and political connection far larger than the England Henry was about to inherit. On the 19th of December, 1154, Henry and Eleanor were crowned at Westminster Abbey. Theobald, Archbishop of Canterbury, performed the coronation for those inside the abbey. The ceremony marked the beginning of a new reign. For the larger story of England, it marked something else as well. The succession planned after the White Ship disaster had finally been resolved, not in the way Henry I intended. His daughter had never been crowned, but her son now wore the crown. Henry II would become the first king of the Angevin, or Plantagenet, line that would dominate English royal history for generations. His reign would have problems of its own. There would be conflict with Thomas Becket. There would be rebellions involving Henry's sons. There would be arguments over law, church authority, inheritance, and the enormous collection of territories Henry tried to govern. No coronation ends political conflict forever. But Henry entered England with one advantage neither Stephen nor Matilda had enjoyed in 1135. There was no serious rival standing beside him with an equally organized claim to the crown. That allowed him to begin restoring royal authority with unusual energy. One of the clearest symbols of the previous reign's disorder was the castle. During the Civil War, fortifications had multiplied, many constructed or strengthened by local lords without effective royal permission. Not every castle was a center of lawlessness, and modern historians are careful not to imagine the entire country as a wasteland filled with robber barons. England had continued to farm, trade, pray, marry, inherit, and administer throughout the war. But the growth of private military power had weakened the crown in important regions. Henry moved to reverse that. Unauthorized castles were ordered down or returned to royal control. Royal lands that had been granted away during years of political bargaining were reclaimed. Officials were replaced where necessary. The monarchy again began to act as though temporary wartime concessions were exactly that, temporary. For ordinary people, the change would not have arrived as one dramatic morning when everything suddenly became peaceful. A village did not wake on December 20th and discover that 18 years of instability had vanished overnight. The effects were slower. A road that had been dangerous became more predictable. A local lord who had maintained an oversized garrison might dismiss men he no longer needed. A disputed castle might return to the king. Taxes and obligations could once again be argued within a government that was not simultaneously fighting for its own existence. Merchants cared about this kind of stability. So did monasteries. So did landowners trying to plan beyond the next campaigning season. So did families whose lives never appear in chronicles because they did not command armies or marry kings. The greatest difference between war and peace is often made of such small calculations. Can a cart leave for market tomorrow? Will a field still belong to the same tenant after harvest? Is the bridge ahead controlled by someone who recognizes the king's officers? Can a monastery send rents from a distant estate without hiring protection? Can a family repair a roof without worrying that soldiers will take the timber next month? These are not questions that create famous battle scenes. They are the questions that decide whether political order means anything outside a palace. The anarchy had never affected every part of England equally. Some regions suffered repeated campaigning, siege warfare, and private fortification. Others experienced long stretches of relative normality. That unevenness matters because the famous phrase associated with the reign, the idea that Christ and his saints slept, came from a chronicler describing a world of disorder and suffering. It is powerful writing, but it should not be mistaken for a statistical survey of every village in England. The reality was more complicated. Royal authority weakened. Violence could become severe. Local power grew in ways the monarchy struggled to control. At the same time, institutions survived. Government continued. Churches functioned. Towns traded. People adapted. That complexity is part of what makes the period more interesting than its nickname. The war was not 18 uninterrupted years of chaos. It was a succession crisis that repeatedly failed to produce a final political answer. And because the answer remained uncertain, every local dispute could become connected to the struggle at the top. Henry II's achievement in 1154 was not that he magically repaired a ruined country. It was that he inherited a settlement strong enough to let government become government again, rather than one faction in an unresolved civil war. Matilda watched much of this from Normandy. She did not disappear from politics when her son became king. She remained an experienced figure within the family's continental government and continued to advise Henry. Her life had given her a range of political experience few people in 12th century Europe could match. She had been a child bride sent to the imperial court. She had been an empress, a widow, a countess in Anjou, a disputed heir to England, a commander of a political faction, a near ruler in London, a fugitive from Oxford, and finally, the mother of a king. She lived until 1167. That meant she survived long enough to see that the settlement of 1153 had not been temporary. Her son was not merely a compromise candidate waiting for another rebellion to remove him. He became one of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe. There is an irony in that outcome. The argument used against Matilda had often centered on whether a woman could exercise kingship in England. She never received the chance to settle the question through an undisputed reign. Yet the dynasty that followed Stephen rested entirely on her blood claim. Henry II did not replace Stephen because he was Stephen's son. He replaced him because he was Matilda's. In the end, the hereditary argument that had failed to crown the mother helped crown the son. Stephen's reputation is equally difficult to compress into a simple judgment. He is often remembered as the king whose weakness allowed the anarchy to happen. There is truth behind the criticism. His authority was inconsistent. His treatment of powerful nobles sometimes created enemies he could not afford. He failed to secure the succession for Eustace. He could be generous when ruthlessness might have strengthened his position, then forceful at moments when compromise might have served him better. But a reign lasting 19 years in the face of civil war, cannot be explained by incompetence alone. Stephen was personally brave. He fought in battle. He survived capture. He recovered politically after disasters that would have ended many kings. He retained substantial loyalty even after Normandy was lost and Henry's power increased. The final treaty was therefore not simply a strong young conqueror dictating terms to a helpless old king. It was the product of exhaustion, altered dynastic circumstances, and a growing recognition on both sides that continuation offered less than compromise. That may be the most useful way to understand the end of the anarchy. Nobody solved the original argument. Was Matilda the rightful monarch because Henry I had named her and made his nobles swear to support her? Was Stephen's coronation legitimate because he had secured recognition and actually exercised kingship? Medieval politics had no neutral court capable of giving a final answer that everyone was required to accept. Instead, time changed the question. By 1153, England no longer needed to decide whether Matilda or Stephen should have won in 1135. It needed to decide what should happen next. Henry was the answer both sides could live with. And that is why the war ended not with a final charge across a field, but with men refusing to make one. At Wallingford, the absence of a decisive battle became more important than a battle might have been. The barons who would not fight helped create the space for negotiation. Eustace's death removed the most dangerous obstacle. Stephen accepted a future he had spent years trying to prevent. Henry accepted a delay when he might have continued fighting for immediate possession of the crown. The result was imperfect. That was precisely its strength. Now return, for a moment, to the beginning. Barfleur, November 1120. The harbour darkening as the white ship prepared to leave. William Adelin was 17 years old. Nobody on the waterfront could have known that his death would still be shaping English politics more than 3 decades later. The ship struck the Quilbeuf rock before it had gone far. The heir drowned. Henry I spent the rest of his reign trying to prevent the uncertainty that followed. He chose Matilda. He demanded oaths. He arranged marriages and alliances. And still, when he died, the succession broke apart. Stephen took the crown in 1135. Matilda crossed to England in 1139. Stephen was captured in 1141. Matilda nearly became queen that same year. Stephen returned. Matilda escaped Oxford. Robert of Gloucester died. Henry grew from a child into a duke. Normandy changed hands. Alliances aged. The men who began the war became the men who were tired enough to end it. Then another royal son died, and the road to peace opened. History sometimes looks inevitable when read backward. From the coronation of Henry II, it is tempting to see every earlier event as a step leading toward him. But the people living through these years did not know the ending. Matilda did not know, while escaping Oxford in the snow, that her son would one day enter Westminster without a rival army waiting outside. Stephen did not know, when he was crowned in 1135, that the child of the woman he displaced would become his acknowledged heir. Henry I did not know, when he made the nobles swear their oaths, that those promises would help produce a civil war rather than prevent one. And William Adelin certainly did not know as the white ship left Barfleur that a short journey across the Channel would become the opening event in one of the most famous succession crises of medieval England. That uncertainty is what connects the story. Kings could command armies. Queens could organize factions. Nobles could build castles. Bishops could negotiate. But nobody could completely control inheritance, weather, illness, loyalty, or death. The anarchy was shaped as much by those limits as by ambition. By the end of 1154, the banners had changed. A new king sat on the throne. The young man who had once arrived in England with borrowed money and an uncertain following now ruled a collection of territories stretching far beyond the kingdom itself. Matilda's long struggle had produced a result, though not the one she first sought. Stephen's long defense of his crown had ended with a peaceful transfer to his rival's son, and England entered a different chapter. Outside Westminster, winter settled over the city. The river moved past its banks beneath the cold December air. Boats still crossed where they could. Smoke rose from houses and workshops. Inside halls, fires burned against the dark. Somewhere beyond London, a messenger carried news of the coronation along a road that had once carried reports of sieges and rebellion. At monasteries, bells marked the hours as they had before the war and throughout it. In villages, people prepared for another winter with no reason to know that historians centuries later would divide their lives into the reign of Stephen and the reign of Henry II. For them, the change would be measured more quietly. A king had died, another had been crowned, and this time, no second claimant was gathering an army to challenge him. The succession was settled. The castles would not all fall silent at once. Old disputes would not vanish. But the question that had followed England since the White Ship went down was finally closed. The crown had passed to Henry II. The Civil War was over. And after 34 years of consequences from a single night at sea, England could finally move beyond the missing heir who never came home. For now, the roads grow darker beyond the town. The last carts have passed through the gates. The river is quiet beneath the winter sky. In the great halls, conversations fade and the fires settle lower in their hearths. The story that began on cold water ends on another winter night, not with a battle, but with a kingdom no longer waiting to learn who will rule next. And there, with the bells of Westminster fading into the distance, we can leave Stephen, Matilda, and Henry behind. Their argument has ended. The crown has passed on, and England, at last, is quiet.